The Boys has come to an end after 7 years and 5 seasons, and the response has been decidedly mixed. And it is quite obvious why. The clever satire had mostly died out through the seasons, and it began feeling too on the nose. Storylines became repetitive after a point, and the show often felt like it was meandering instead of moving towards a clear conclusion, which eventually led to a messy final season and a rushed small scale finale. And this has really made me ponder a question. Why have underwhelming TV finales become so common now? Welcome everyone. This is The Milestoner, and today I really want to discuss the rapid decline in quality when it comes to TV show finales. Now, since I'll be talking about endings to several shows, there will obviously be spoilers involved, so you have been warned. Now, disappointing endings to TV shows have always existed. How I Met Your Mother ended with the biggest dunk in the audience's goodwill. We waited 8 seasons to finally meet the titular mother, only for her to be abruptly killed off in the end, so that the story could just circle back to Ted and Robin. Why? I haven't watched Dexter, but even people like me who have never seen the show know how infamously disappointing its ending was. It became so badly received that the franchise has been continuously putting out more sequels and spin offs, desperately trying to land a satisfying conclusion. Sherlock was excellent when it first started airing, but by the time the final season arrived, it was completely out of steam. The writing became so illogical and over the top that fans genuinely convinced themselves that there was a secret final episode coming that would fix the ending. And obviously, everyone knows about Game of Thrones. It has gone down in history as one of the worst TV endings of all time. By completely changing character and story beats in the name of subverting expectations, the final season went off the rails, and it delivered an ending that made the years of investment in the show feel like a complete waste. But these were few and far between. These bad endings were sprinkled in between the greats: Breaking Bad, Friends, Avatar The Last Airbender, Succession, Better Call Saul. They all had perfect endings that made the journey completely worth it. Even The Sopranos, whose finale was hugely controversial at the time of release, has now gone down as one of the most iconic and best TV endings of all time. But nowadays, the tide has shifted. A vast majority of shows released nowadays stumble right at the finish line. Case in point, Stranger Things. I have already made a full video discussing my thoughts on the final season, so if you want to check that out, it's right up here. But in a nutshell, a show which began as a tightly knit thriller set in a small town became too huge for its own good. Every season started to raise the spectacle further, until the final season literally had our heroes fighting a kaiju to save the world. And that meant completely sacrificing the core of the show. Characters developed absurd plot armor, major lore was retconned to fit a grander narrative and more villains, and logic completely went out the window. Sure, the epilogue was heartwarming, but everything that came before it felt hollow, like an ending written simply because the story needed to end, not because the writers had a clear destination in mind. Which honestly isn't surprising considering the Duffer brothers admitted that they still didn't know fully how the story would end while filming the season. Another prime example is The Walking Dead. Starting off as an intense zombie survival drama, the show quickly gained massive success through the seasons due to its mature writing and themes. But over time, the story became repetitive and it started feeling like the creators prioritized shock value over meaningful storytelling. This issue really exploded during season 7 and 6. The pacing slowed down to a crawl, characters lost their depth, and the series started feeling directionless. But the biggest mistake the show made was with Rick Grimes. The literal main character was removed from the series and pushed into spin offs, leaving the final seasons without the emotional core of the story. And instead of ending the story naturally, it literally expanded into a franchise of spin offs and side stories. And honestly, that is the biggest issue with modern television. Instead of writing a meaningful story, shows are now more focused on milking the popularity of the brand. Spin offs and unnecessary seasons have dragged out what should be smaller stories. The biggest victim of this might be Squid Game. Season 1 arrived out of nowhere and became a global phenomenon because of its sharp themes and self contained narrative. But once it exploded in popularity, we suddenly got seasons 2 and 3. Additions that ultimately diluted the original message and made the story feel extremely pointless. And the finale of season 3 teased an American spin off, so of course the cycle continues. Alice in Borderland also had a similar issue. Seasons 1 and 2 were a clear, concise story, but we still got an unnecessary season 3, which, while not as bad as the other final seasons I have mentioned before, still feels completely pointless. It changed nothing regarding the characters or the story. A lot of modern shows begin with strong concepts and compelling themes, but they eventually just collapse because the writers simply don't know how to conclude the story in a satisfying way. The best example of this is The Umbrella Academy. For 3 seasons, we had followed the Hargreaves family through their dysfunctional family dynamics, only for all of their stories to be completely butchered in the final season. The biggest victim of this probably was Five, who was arguably the scene stealer and the lead character of the entire show. And he completely had his character assassinated in an unnecessary love triangle. Years of intrigue and build up regarding both story and individual characters were just thrown aside in favor of a rushed conclusion. You also suffered heavily from this. Yes, you. I mean the show, you. We had followed Joe Goldberg for 4 seasons as he slowly evolved from a manipulative but methodical stalker into a truly unhinged psychopath. And then in season 5, he felt almost cartoonishly reckless. He was constantly making mistakes and behaving less like the calculating predator we had come to know and more like a desperate, lovesick fool. Sure, the ending to Joe's character feels completely earned on paper, but the road to get there just felt messy. In my opinion, the show should have just ended after season 3. Sex Education was a charming show with balanced humor with genuine heart and quirky fun characters. But the final season completely pulled the plug on all of it. Fan favorite characters were sidelined in favor of annoying new characters, meaningless storylines were just shoved in, and the ultimate resolutions felt like letdowns. And all of that brings us back to The Boys. One of the biggest shows of the decade, a sharp satire of superheroes, celebrity culture, and politics that in many ways improved upon the source material. However, the cracks began showing from season 4. The satire was no longer subtle, and characters had the most absurd plotlines which just began feeling distasteful. And then came the spin offs. It was clear that the show was committing all of the cardinal sins. Expanding the universe instead of focusing on the core story? Check. Meandering through subplots without narrative urgency? Check. Giving characters ridiculous amounts of plot armor? Check. Now, season 5 did start off well with what might be one of the best episodes of the show, and then it quickly went downhill. The plot wandered aimlessly, characters lacked urgency, and most of the spotlight was shifted towards Soldier Boy in a way that felt less like storytelling and more like setup for the upcoming spin-off What Rising. And then came the finale, a 1-hour episode trying to wrap up at least 10 major storylines. And honestly, it was good for the most part. It tied up most loose ends in a reasonably satisfying way, but everything felt incredibly rushed. I'll never agree with people comparing it to Game of Thrones levels of disaster because no, it was not that bad. But was the final season messy overall? Definitely. The Boys has now joined the ever-growing list of shows with disappointing final seasons. Sure, there are anomalies here and there like Andor, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Money Heist, Dark, which actually had satisfying endings to their stories. But nowadays, it's a lot like finding a needle in a haystack. And that is the new norm. Streaming has completely changed the landscape of television. Everything now just needs to become a franchise, a universe, or an endlessly expandable brand. Stories are stressed far beyond their natural endpoint because platforms are terrified of letting successful IPs die. Modern television does not know how and when to stop. But those are just my thoughts. Do tell me down in the comments what your thoughts are, what you thought of The Boys' final season and the finale, and if you agree or disagree with my thoughts. Let me know what you feel about all of the other shows that I mentioned here, and if you are also equally disappointed by all of these final seasons, and if there is any other show that heavily disappointed you by the time it got to the end. Also, if you like this video, do like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.